to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Jang-cho. President Trump announced the details of his second summit with Chairman Kim Jong-un. Many are hoping to see meaningful progress this time. And today we take a look at what the two leaders will likely trade when they meet.
Chairman Kim and I will meet again on February 27th and 28th in Vietnam. Much work remains to be done, but my relationship with Kim Jong-un is a good one.
Destroy their plutonium and uranium enrichment facilities. The North Koreans have also added the critical words, and more.
In the studio with me today, Ms. Jean Lee, Director of the Korea Program at the 윌슨센터. Ms. Lee is an award-winning journalist and was the first Pyongyang bureau chief for the Associated Press. Also joining me today, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, President Trump announced his second summit with Chairman Kim. Does this mean the two sides have agreed on some kind of deliverables?
I think they're going to still be working on that. We know that Special Representative Began has been in Pyongyang for the past 3 days trying to nail things down. I think it's pretty clear that there is a kind of framework that they can work on in terms of hammering away at some kind of understanding. But given the history of hostility and the gap between the two, there's clearly a lot of work to be done, and we have a very short period of time to do it.
And why do you think was Mr. Began in Pyongyang for 3 days for marathon talks?
So this is a particularly long trip to be in Pyongyang, and that's actually very promising. I hope that means that they sorted out far more than just the date and the location, and that they did, as Scott mentioned, map out what the deliverables will be, but I'm hoping that they managed to get something concrete to discuss and to agree upon at that summit.
Mm-hmm. So getting into the trade-off, what do you think North Korea is ready to offer to the United States at this point regarding denuclearization steps?
Well, I think that what we've seen so far from the North Koreans is an expression of willingness to have international inspections of Yongbyon and Tongchang-ri. And of course, we know that from a U.S. perspective, that is really not enough, but it may end up being a starting point. And then the question is going to be, can we maintain momentum? But I think that it's going to be absolutely essential that we see a process come out of this second summit as a basis upon which to pursue those objectives.
Mm-hmm. And Jean, do you think North Korea may even offer something more than Tongchang-ri and Yongbyon and Punggye-ri, which it has already offered on the table?
That remains to be seen. I think we should remember that North Korea's objective will be to hold on to its nuclear program as long as it can. And part of this negotiation will be it's a back and forth, will be for the United States to get more concessions or more commitments, concrete steps from North Korea in exchange for concessions from the U.S. I just want to point out that the leader of North Korea, when he met with President Moon in September in Pyongyang, did say that North Korea was willing to negotiate additional steps. And that's when he mentioned the dismantlement of Yongbyon. And also in the talks in October with Secretary Pompeo, there was discussion of that as a possible additional step. So I haven't heard anything beyond that, but certainly let's see what comes out of the meeting in Pyongyang this week to see if they were able to get some commitments from North Korea on further steps.
I have a suspicion that Began went to Pyongyang ready to trade more for more, and that we're really trying to test whether or not North Korea is willing to take a big next step. And so I think that what we hear from that visit over the course of the next few days in preparation for the summit will be critical to understanding what we can really expect when the leaders meet in Vietnam.
So Jean, what do you think North Korea's strategy going forward, denuclearization strategy, going to the second summit and beyond?
I do think their strategy will be to stretch this process out, which would enable them to hold on to their weapons as long as they can. And as they've said, they want a step-by-step process with corresponding measures and to get the most that they can from the United States in return for each step that they take. And so it's up to the United States also to map out what they'll give the North Koreans in return for each step that North Korea takes. Really, while committing to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, Kim Jong-un also does recognize that those nuclear weapons and those programs give him so much legitimacy. And so it's not surprising at all, we shouldn't be surprised at all that he might want to hold on to those as long as he can.
Do you agree?
Well, I actually think that one of the really interesting dynamics right now is related to time frame. And the issue there is Trump is now a little bit more embattled. The North Koreans may not be sure whether Trump is going to be around in 3 years as a partner. And that means you've only got 2 years. And so I actually think that the closer we get to the end of the administration, the more the North Koreans will be tempted to batten down the hatches and to wait and see what they can get. But at the same time, at present, they've put all their chips on Trump. And so they actually also need to find a way to broaden their engagement with the U.S. in order to hold and stand pat in terms of reaping the gains that they've tried to make.
I think that's absolutely right. We have to remember that they recognize that they have an opportunity here with this president, with President Trump, and so they're making that calculation. We need to make sure that we get as much done as we can while he's still president, while still recognizing that things could change when there's an administration change.
So we looked at what North Korea is willing to offer, but I want to now look at what U.S. must get from North Korea at this point. So what do you think is the minimum that U.S. should get from North Korea in terms of denuclearization steps at the second summit?
Well, my own view has consistently been that what we need to see from North Korea is a set of steps in the area of denuclearization that symbolize North Korea's seriousness of purpose to actually try to achieve that objective. And we should be willing to offer something similar on the peace side, but the real test of North Korean sincerity from our perspective is what are they willing to actually do that will suggest that they are committed to the idea of achieving complete denuclearization.
There are some tangible steps that North Korea can take based on past experience. For example, we have been hearing about a call for the return of international inspectors who can verify that the steps that North Korea says it's taken, and particularly in relation to Punggye-ri, that they can verify that that's been taken so we can move forward and put that in the box of things that North Korea says it has done. It has been more than a decade since those international inspectors have been on the ground in North Korea. So I would really like to see North Korea allow them back in as a proof of their commitment and their openness to allowing the rest of the world to verify that what they have said they've done has actually been conducted in an irreversible manner.
And what's really interesting to me was that Special Representative Began said North Korea committed to plutonium and uranium facilities, dismantling them, and also committed to even more. So what do you think are more actions that the U.S. is looking for at this time?
Well, it's hard to know what the North Koreans might have committed to, but I think there's a long list of things that the U.S. would want from North Korea in the area of weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons programs. We have a serious issue with North Korean cyber activities. And of course, there is the human rights issue that is going to have to be dealt with if we can imagine that the U.S. and North Korea will actually be able to achieve a normal relationship.
And Special Representative Began also said that he will not ask for the declaration list right now. So when do you think the U.S. should ask for that list then?
I was just going to say that has to be part of the process, because if we don't quite know what the entire scope of their capability is, it's very hard to verify that they fully denuclearize. So that has to be part of the process. But I think the U.S. is starting to recognize that asking for that upfront as a precondition is a non-starter with the North Koreans, and that the North Koreans see that as a violation of their sovereignty. And so that will have to come as part of this process that we see unfolding over the course of not just days or weeks, but perhaps months and years.
And Scott, those undeclared facilities, are they now lower in the priority, early in the process?
In some ways, by definition, they are going to be later on in this particular process. I mean, initially, the U.S. wanted to see the entire pie. The North Koreans have said, we're just going to give you a piece of the pie. But at some point, the U.S. appetite is large enough that it's going to want to devour the whole pie, and that includes the undeclared facilities.
And now I want to look at what U.S. can offer. So, Jean, what do you think U.S. can offer to North Korea at this point?
And there's one thing I think that is very concrete that the U.S. President Trump might have promised, and that might be something related to the Korean War. That might be something that he said, we will discuss this. It may be an end-of-war declaration and the start of a discussion about an eventual peace treaty. That is something that the North Koreans have been pushing for a long time and would be something that might be seen as fairly easy to agree to. I think it's a complicated issue, and I do think that that is a huge concession on the part of the United States and needs to be leveraged properly. But I do think that that's something that we will see them discuss or perhaps declare at this summit.
Mm-hmm. Do you also expect a declaration at the summit?
Well, I'm not going to say precisely what we can expect, but I think that it's very clear that Special Representative Biegun signaled a willingness by the president to lean forward on the idea of making peace on the Korean Peninsula. President Trump has already made that very clear. And so I think the big question, that is our leverage. And so I think the big question is, what is North Korea willing to pay to us in order to achieve that objective?
Other than the end of war declaration, what other concessions do you think U.S. is willing to offer right now?
Well, the other areas are really related to possibly some selective sanctions lifting. I can imagine some specific sanctions lifting in the areas that might support expansion of the inter-Korean economic relationship. And then political measures, including possibly the establishment of liaison offices, which would also have the benefit of allowing better communication between the two sides, which is clearly something that we need in order to support this process.
And Jean, U.S. is very clear that sanctions relief will come after denuclearization, but this is what North Korea really wants. So is there any leeway? What can the U.S. do regarding easing sanctions on North Korea right now?
The United States, the government has been very clear that they want the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea before sanctions are lifted. But I think that that is the end point, and we are probably going to see, if they map out this long process, them perhaps, as Scott mentioned, offering some selective sanctions, and that is what North Korea wants and needs. So will they be able to negotiate what that roadmap looks like so that North Korea offers enough concrete signs of commitment to warrant a lifting of some sanctions on the U.S. side? You know, a lot of this is about trust, building confidence between these countries that have been foes for decades now. And so while neither side is going to get exactly what they want in the end, they need to make those initial steps so they can build confidence and build trust. So a lot of what we're seeing in these early stages is about building trust.
I think that's right, but I also believe that what the Trump administration, what Trump and Pompeo seem to be betting on, is that it's also about aspiration. And I think Moon's bought into this too, to the extent that they are betting that Kim Jong-un really wants to pursue an economic development path that will draw him into the world, and that actually will require him to make the choice between economic development and holding on to the nuclear capabilities.
Well, we'll talk about the economic development later on in our program, but before we go, I want to ask, if North Korea comes to the summit with insincerity and only agrees to a vague agreement, what will be the repercussions, having that kind of vague agreement one more time again?
As far as I'm concerned, it's not so much a matter of insincerity. I do think the North Koreans want this process to work. It's a matter of how well are they going to negotiate, how well is the United States going to negotiate, who's going to be the better negotiator here. So it's absolutely important that the United States be able to answer every challenge that the North Koreans pose in terms of that negotiation. I do think the stakes are very high. we have to remember that there are some impatient partners in this entire process in the region who don't want the U.S. president to go into another summit with a North Korean leader and not get something tangible in return. And so I think there is quite a bit of impatience on the part of not only critics here in the United States, but partners in the region who want more to come out of that process rather than just a vague statement like we had in Singapore.
Partner as in Japan?
Japan, I think the South Koreans are anxious for some movement on the U.S.-North Korean relationship so that they can engage them in these inter-Korean projects that Scott mentioned. And so we have to remember that there's a lot at stake here at this summit, and that there's a lot of expectation of more than just that vague promise that was made in Singapore.
I think it's safe to say that if we have a repeat of Singapore, then there's going to be just a barrage of criticism directed at the president for undertaking this process. And so that's really the leverage that I think that the U.S. is trying to use by pursuing symmetry with North Korea, is the idea that with each summit, we have to raise the bar a little bit higher in terms of the expectations for the process and the result.
Well, my expectation is definitely higher than the first summit. We'll move on to the next segment and watch video for the next segment.
President Trump believes your country can replicate this path. It's yours if you'll seize the moment.
Vietnam illustrates the Trump administration's economic and diplomatic vision for North Korea. Will the Vietnam model be appealing to Chairman Kim? Now, Jean, what is the symbolism in selecting Vietnam as the summit venue?
There are many considerations on both sides for picking an appropriate summit venue. I think when I'm looking at what places would be possible, I look at both where has President Trump been and what place does he think is appropriate as a venue. And remember that he was in Vietnam in November 2017 for APEC. So he knows that it's a suitable venue. And also the North Koreans will feel secure and safe in Vietnam, a country with which it has had long relationship, diplomatic relations, and they understand that the security is capable of protecting their interests. But there's more than that, obviously. I also think about Kim Jong-un's need to signal to his people back home that this summit can provide an example of what their future may hold. Vietnam, like North Korea, is a communist country. To be able to see another Asian country that was a former enemy of the United States working with the United States holds a lot of promise, and also one, obviously, that has improved its economy drastically over the past decade. So I think there's a lot of symbolism there in terms of the potential that they might pose for the North Korean people, but also in terms of security, that's something that's a consideration as well for both the United States and the North Koreans.
Mm-hmm. So this possible economic future for North Korea, what Jean just explained, is what Trump administration is trying to portray to North Korea. But Scott, do you think this is exactly what North Korea wants?
Well, it seems that Kim Jong-un has been talking about this, both with other leaders, including Moon Jae-in, and we clearly see a shift in terms of a focus on economic development internally. And I actually think that in some ways the language that Kim Jong-un has begun to use in some cases sounds like the language that Deng Xiaoping used. And so I do think that there is something afoot inside North Korea. There's a desire to make North Korea prosperous, but it's still not quite clear whether North Korea is going to be willing to take some of the steps that we have in mind that would be necessary prerequisites for achieving that prosperity, and denuclearization is probably the biggest one.
Mm-hmm. And Jean, do you think North Korea and the people are ready for the opening up of the economy and to the world?
The people are ready, but is the regime ready? I think while the prospect of economic development is very enticing, it's also very terrifying for North Koreans, both for the government in terms of the loss of control. They've seen other countries open up. China, although they look to China as an example on so many fronts, they do often say that the government has lost some control over the people. And so that aspect of it is something that we need to consider and take into account as we engage the North Koreans economically, that they have some concern that their way of thinking, their way of life might be under assault if they open up to outside influence and outside money. I think Vietnam offers an interesting example for them because it has been able to maintain its political structure. The government has been able to maintain some control over the people. And I don't think when the summit takes place in Vietnam that the people of North Korea will get the full story. The North Koreans will package this trip in a way that works in their interest, but it will offer the very visual hope for the North Korean people that they might be able to go down that path as well.
And rather than the grandiose economic development and opening up, wouldn't North Korea be more interested in just sanctions relief and getting some more hard currency at this time?
Well, of course, they want to see money flow and money supply inside North Korea. But the broader goals are going to require a lot more than that. And actually, Bradley Babson has just written an excellent paper posted on 38 North this week that goes into a lot of detail about the promise that Vietnam has for North Korea. But the two dimensions that I would flag that are absolutely critical are one, North Korea has to improve its internal economic governance, meaning that it has to go from rule by political loyalty to rule of law. And secondly, North Korea has to engage with the international economic community, including the international financial institutions.
And not only economic development, Jean, when it comes to diplomatic relations with the United States, what lesson can North Korea learn from Vietnam?
Vietnam serves as an example of a country that fought a very bitter war with the United States, but has managed to turn that foe into a friend. And so the symbolism of having President Trump meet with Kim Jong-un in Vietnam is very powerful and sends that signal not only to us here in the United States, but also to the North Koreans. So I do think that there's a lot of symbolism there, and they pick that venue very carefully to signal that desire for a transformational change in that relationship. It's very interesting.
There's also a wrinkle, though, there, because Vietnam is a country that achieved unification as a result of winning a war against the United States and seeing the U.S. withdraw militarily. And so I think that if things go south in the U.S.-North Korea talks, that we're likely to see Kim Jong-un use that as a theme in North Korean propaganda internally.
Never thought of that point. Let's end our conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture that looks like Chairman Kim Jong-un and Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte posing for pictures. On closer look, you'll notice they are in fact impersonators. The pair took to the streets of Hong Kong and drew excited crowds who cheered and took selfies with them. Scott, what's your reaction?
Well, it's really fascinating how the Kim dynasty has become a brand unto itself that is so well known internationally. And of course, there's a fascination that is driven by the opacity of the regime and the opacity of the leadership itself. And I think that this plays on that.
Jean?
I did see these pictures, and I would say, well, you know that it's not Kim Jong-un because he does not wear a loyalty pin in real life. And so I do look at these little details if you're looking for a clue on whether this is really him. And also, I would be very curious to know if Kim Jong-un himself would think this was funny or if he would take offense. But hopefully he would find it funny.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ms. Lee, Mr. Snyder, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.